This Parker Brothers title, based on the famous attack on Hoth scene from The Empire Strikes Back, is a good example of why great design is timeless. Things that become outdated are those that weren't particularly good in the first place, just previously accepted due to lack of better alternatives. But this seemingly simple old arcade game is not outdated at all. There's a lot of depth and fun to be found. The loop is very simple. You destroy AT-ATs coming at you, and I don't care they've been pronounced AT-AT in official Star Wars media, that just sounds wrong, until they either kill you and all your extra lives, or reach the rebel base. The choice of the recreated scene is very fitting for an arcade title. The increase in tension is constantly palpable, because just like the rebels in the movie, sooner or later you will lose. All you can do is try to hold on as long as possible. Even with extremely blocky graphics, although the parallax effect is particularly impressive for a game of its time, The Empire Strikes Back still manages to be pretty immersive thanks to this smart connection between context and gameplay. It takes 48 blaster shots to destroy an AT-AT, which is a considerable amount. But from time to time, bomb hatch weak points open up, and should you hit them, you'll destroy the walker in one shot. There is no tow cables like there were in the movie, but that's understandable. With every new enemy spawn being faster and more accurate than the last, it gets increasingly more difficult to destroy the walkers, let alone wait for bomb hatches to open up. And this is where The Empire Strikes Back has a couple extra rules that add tons of strategic enemy management depth to the shooting and avoidance gameplay core. Walkers can't go past each other. The more damage an AT-AT is, their health being represented through color, the slower and less accurate they become. And there can be only 5 enemies on the map at the same time, while a new one can't appear unless the last walker in line is far enough from the spawn point. So, just destroying AT-ATs without thinking is actually detrimental even if you're good at it. To get the highest score possible, you need to strategically slow down existing enemies and delay new ones from spawning. In addition to this strategic layer, The Empire Strikes Back has some risk versus reward mechanics, the implementation of which would actually go against modern best practices, but they're not flaws. First, your snowspeeder is always closer to the right side of the screen, even if you look in that direction, and your shots only hit what's in view. This means that you need to be pretty close to a walker to hit it from behind, but that balances out its lack of defenses from that side. Health of your snowspeeder also involves risk versus reward factors. The amount of shots it can survive is actually random, between 2 and 5. Landing a speeder in a valley repairs it, but you have limited repairs per life. So, how safe you would like to play is up to you. It's easy to call these two aspects poor due to lack of visibility and clear information, but design doesn't exist in a vacuum. In the context of the game, these mechanics work great, and without them players could easily become more overpowered. Besides, it is worth noting that you do get a sense of power every 2 minutes when you enter a special May the Force be with you mode and become invincible for 20 seconds. What you do during this mode is also a matter of strategic decisions, destroying fully 1 or 2 walkers, spreading your attention to slow down multiple AT-ATs, or whatever you think is best depending on the situation. And if you ever feel you need more challenge, there is additional optional modifiers that add smart bombs to AT-ATs, make their bodies solid, or both. Combine all this with very tight and consistent controls, and we've got an incredibly fantastic arcade title on our hands. From the context of it being a pure arcade game, I literally can't think of anything that could be considered as necessary improvements in the game's design. Of course, there are things that could be added, and I think that a modern remake with the same mechanics but new progression systems that would include quests and skin rewards and potentially new enemy types would do wonders, especially on mobile. The actual non-hypothetical game we're discussing will get a Statocritic rating of 83. Personal emotions and enjoyment play a big part in the scoring system, and if I'd be a person for whom chasing a high score would be enough for long-term engagement, the rating would definitely be higher. I would say I was that kind of person during my childhood, but nowadays I do need the aforementioned progression systems for a game like The Empire Strikes Back to engage me for long, which of course doesn't prevent me from appreciating all the intricacies the game has. And it's particularly impressive that the very first Star Wars video game has already set up a pretty considerable quality bar to reach. With the Return of the Jedi getting released in 1983, it makes sense that Parker Brothers will try to capitalize on the success of their Empire Strikes Back game to make something similar for the new movie. But it's such a far cry from the Empire Strikes Back. The concept is solid enough. The game can be divided into 3 stages: trying to get past the shields to the Death Star, blasting the pieces of the Death Star to reach its core and destroy it, and then avoiding the explosions to survive. It's not fun to play though. First, you can have only one blaster shot spawned at a time, and if you fire again, your previous shot disappears if it didn't hit anything yet. On one hand, that's sort of supposed to add some depth, I guess, but the shots are so small and hard to track, and the action is so fast with various ships appearing all over the place that it's difficult to be methodical. It's also really difficult to avoid enemy fire, again because their shots are so small and sometimes easy to confuse with stars. There's also a lack of charitable rules. For example, it's not uncommon for Death Star to shoot and kill you as soon as you respawn, and that just doesn't feel good. So Death Star Battle will get a Statocritic rating of 44. It could be a good action game, but its flaws, which might seem small in nature, affect the experience a lot, and I wouldn't recommend this game unless you're ready to deal with that. Jedi Arena by Parker Brothers is not good, and after a title like Empire Strikes Back, that once again is particularly disappointing. It's sort of a two-player breakout game where you need to remove shield blocks from the other player's side and hit them while protecting your shields, which sounds like it could be fun, but it just doesn't work. First, the direction of the floating droid blast is the same as the direction of your saber, so you're both targeting and defending at the same time. It sounds intriguing in theory, but in practice it's annoying, at least in the existing implementation. And then the player who is on the top of the screen has their controls inverted. I guess it's fine if you also turn your Atari paddle around, but why? I will assign a score of 22 to Jedi Arena. It's a pretty bad game, and I doubt it would be that fun even with a second player. Like with many popular franchises, it was only a matter of time until Star Wars would appear on arcade machines. The original device was developed by Atari, but since then has been ported to a really big amount of home computers and consoles, though this entry listed only solid, faithful ports, like the 1989 Amiga version that's shown on the footage. Others will be discussed separately. The thing is, if you want to play this game, I would personally recommend one of these ports over even official emulation like its appearance as a bonus in Rebel Strike, because the controls of the original are really fine-tuned to the yoke that was part of it, and emulating that doesn't feel great even with the mouse, let alone a controller stick. And the way controls feel is extremely important here, because in its recreation of the Death Star battle from A New Hope, Star Wars is all about action, precision, and reflexes. That's it. You destroy TIE fighters, you destroy fireballs they launch at you, which replace the movie's blaster shots for the purposes of gameplay, you destroy towers, you go into the trench, fire a rocket at the exhaust port, try again, but now with more enemies, towers, and obstacles. Pure arcade action goodness. What I personally found a big problem both in the original as well as its ports are the vector graphics, particularly when it comes to enemy fireballs. Unlike bigger objects, they don't really showcase their angle very well, so it is actually tricky to understand whether a particular fireball will hit you if not destroyed. And then when you do shoot a fireball, although the central part is removed immediately, the outer one has a disappearance animation that won't hurt you. Sounds harmless, except on higher difficulty levels the amount of leftover effects from all the fireballs makes it really difficult to understand which shots you have destroyed. Likewise, it can be difficult to understand whether you will crash into a tower or an obstacle in the trench. You can get used to it in time, and if you play enough, start getting a feel for it, but I don't think that means it's a good implementation. Though I do understand that the vector graphics were used to create this 3D gameplay in a reasonable manner given the technology of the times. And for what it's worth, like the Empire Strikes Back on Atari, despite simplistic looking graphics, the game's mechanics work well enough with the context of launching a desperate assault on the Death Star that you do feel quite immersed in the experience, especially if you're playing the actual arcade machine. I will assign a Statocritic rating of 71. It's a good game and can be pretty addicting if you are a high score seeker, but there are some aspects that could be improved. Plenty of Star Wars ports across the years would fail to capture the quality of the original one way or another. And while the nature of problems in these ports are different, for example on the Atari 2600 version you can't move the targeting reticle as fast while shooting, which really changes the pacing of gameplay not in a great way, I've put all these ports under a single entry as in the end the final result is the same. They're okay-ish, but not as fun to play as the original arcade machine. If you're asking why there's Commodore 64 again in the platform list, it's because there were actually 2 ports on that computer, and one of them has this weird dissonance between frame rate and controls, again making it fairly uncomfortable to play. So, the versions in this entry will get a Statocritic rating of 47. For the time, I suppose they were fine enough to experience the Star Wars arcade game if you happen to own only one of these platforms, but nowadays there is no real reason to seek them out. What is it with the Return of the Jedi not being able to take a break? First, the Death Star battle was disappointing in comparison to the Empire Strikes Back, now Atari's arcade outing is disappointing in comparison to the previous one. The controls are wonky, collision detection is weird, sometimes you're automatically magnetized towards special objects that give points and sometimes you're not and you die, and there is a stage which abruptly switches between an AT-ST and Millennium Falcon. I know that the intent was to simulate the parallel going battles like it happened in the movie, but in the context of the game the switches feel really sporadic. And even though some of the home computer ports do play a bit clunkier than the arcade version, I'm not separating them into a different entry because by and large they don't provide a particularly worse experience than the already underwhelming original. Return of the Jedi, with its Metacritic rating of 45, definitely can't be called bad, and some Star Wars fans might find enjoyment in it, but at the same time the game isn't particularly enticing. Atari's Empire Strikes Back is actually not a separate arcade machine, but rather a conversion of the 1983 Star Wars. I would say that in terms of core mechanics, it is a definite improvement. There is a far bigger variation of enemies and obstacles, which were again inspired by the Battle of Hoth sequence from the movie. First, you start by destroying the scouting probes, then you defend the rebel base against the walkers, then you fly through attacking TIE fighters attempting to escape, and at the end of it all, survive an asteroid field. A bunch of new enemies have weak points, AT-ATs can be destroyed by both hitting those weak points as well as firing tow cables. By defeating enough enemies before the stage is complete, you'll get a letter to fill the word Jedi, and when you do, you get a big amount of bonus points. Due to this bigger variety in core gameplay, I personally have enjoyed The Empire Strikes Back much more than the original Star Wars arcade game. However, I also can't say that it's a total improvement. The progression is far less interesting. Star Wars with each retry would add new types of obstacles that change up the pace of the gameplay, as well as vary the firing habits of existing ones, not just the delay between shots, but also the amount of fireballs and their scattershot trajectory. The Empire Strikes Back, on the other hand, just goes, here's more enemies, here's more shit they throw at you, deal with it. It gets the job done in terms of progressive difficulty, but it's not as interesting. Also, I would say that because of how the gameplay works, you don't really feel like you're defending a base and then escaping. The game tries to rectify this through some story-related text on screen, but in terms of actual mechanics, it still feels like you're in a desperate offensive. I do have to provide a special mention to the home computer ports of this game. Even on weaker devices like BBC Micro and Amstrad CPC, they run really well. Not without slowdowns and lags, but the experience is far more comparable with the original than it was for the 1983 arcade game, so this time I don't see a need to separate those versions into a different entry. The Empire Strikes Back is going to get a Metacritic rating of 72. It's a good arcade game, could be even better with spruced up progression, but even in its current form, if you like chasing high scores, you're going to get a lot out of this title. The Battle of Hoth is one of the most adapted movie moments in Star Wars games. A very big number of them feature a recreation of it one way or another. I guess on a core conceptual level it fits the world of video games really well, possibly that's why the recreation of that battle in game form had the most success quality-wise. Now, you might have noticed that in this era, even games that were released on home consoles or computers were all part of the arcade genre, something with a relatively small repeatable core loop focused on getting a high score. However, in the next video, we will see how Star Wars games start to expand beyond that into more adventurous experiences.